I'm standing in front of the wall built by the King Philippe-II, otherwise known as Philippe-Auguste, in 1190. This is the oldest remaining wall in Paris, and the part we're seeing here is the largest piece of that wall. It measures about 70 meters and about 60 meters between two towers, one that you see behind me and one that's just to my right over here. The wall altogether was 5 kilometers in circumference, which measures out an area that's approximately 3/4 of the surface of Central Park, just to give you an idea of Paris at the time. And Paris in its day was the second largest city in Europe, and the population of Paris at the time was 110,000 people. So Philippe-Auguste decided to enclose this section of Paris first. This is what's called the right bank, which is the north bank of the Seine. And that's because the enemies came more from the north, being the English, than from the south. And then 10 years later, he began the second part of the circle around Paris. The technology of this wall is very appropriate for its day and perfectly adapted to anything that's propelled by a spring, which is essentially anything with a bow and arrow, a trebuchet. Basically, the longest shooting distance of a bow and arrow that could be shot accurately was about 100 meters. So there were 77 towers in all encircling Paris, and between each pair was approximately 60 meters. So you would really get caught right between the crossfires, and this was perfectly calculated. And if you were to take like a laser pointer or a scanner, you could actually calculate the distance of the walls between the towers. Also, the strength of impact of this kind of artillery wasn't very strong, and therefore the walls didn't have to be super thick. So the walls here are 3 meters at the base of stone and then sloping up to 2 meters at the top. They are basically cut stone, limestone, and filled with sand and a little bit of cement and rubble. At the top, it was still wide enough for a cart or soldiers to pass. It was about, as I said, 2 meters tall, and there would have been on either side at the top crenellations to protect arrow shooters. On the walls, we can actually see still remaining some of the marks of the stonemasons that they would use when they would quarry the stones, in order that you could trace the stones to the wall, and then they would be paid for the numbers of stones that were used. So we can see on my right, for example, this cross. That's the mark of one stonemason, or this kind of backwards N-shaped, and they're repeated down the walls in other places. So that shows you that there was a certain amount of technique and pride and a very large budget expended in making this wall. Now, where we are today has now become a sports ground where they put, basically this is a soccer field, and there's a basketball behind us. Perhaps you can even hear some of the basketballs while I'm talking. So what you have to imagine is that this wall was much closer in, with a lot of urban fabric filling it in. And just to give you an idea, you can see the church of St. Paul Saint-Louis right behind us, and that was built, 600 years after the wall of Philippe-Auguste, but you can see how close it is to the wall, just to give you an idea of how much was demolished to create this sense of space and to make an urban park. So here what we see is a very good example of how urban infill started to ignore what remained of the walls of Philippe-Auguste, because the street right behind me has nothing to do with the walls at all. Like, there wasn't a gate behind me or anything that would relate to this, where the street was. What we can see is a little piece of the wraparound part of the tower, and how all we really have left is just one facing, the facing blocks on the outside of the wall, and that the rest has been lost. And on the other side of that wraparound, you see an official government building from the 19th century come right up to the wall and just taking it over. This area is very typical of the way that walls are reused when there is space that remains out of the walls, because of the clearing that's used for sports and sporting activity or health activities. That's very typical of 20th century expansion outside walls, and very typical of 17th century expansion, or even earlier, is the idea of the banlieue or the suburbs where you have religious buildings, and very typical and particularly characteristic of the Philippe-Auguste period is the way that you see the building right behind encroaching and all the other, and you have to imagine all the other buildings that encroached pretty soon after the wall was built.